And we'll admit all. Whoa. Okay, we're just going to give it about a minute or two just for everyone to join. We had about 120 registered and we've got 53 in there now, so just wait for a minute or so before we kick it off. To those that have just joined, we'll just give it a minute or so for other people to come in. So we'll kick off in about a minute, just to let more people come in. We've got about half the registered people have joined so far. Okay, well, that's been a couple of minutes. I expect there will be more people joining, and we are already recording this presentation, so I'm going to kick it off. So my name is Mark Stockdale. I'm a Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Transporting New Zealand, and my co-host is Rob Giller from the Bus and Coach Association. And we'll just continue letting people in, but we'll start with the agenda. So firstly, I'm just going to give a very brief background into the new Act and the reason why we're here. Then our first presenter is Inspector Scott Richardson from the Police Commercial Vehicle Safety Team. He's going to talk about what that actually is. Then we've got Glenn Dobson from the Drug Detection Agency. He's going to give us some background on what the testing that they do in the workplace, and also around setting up a drug and alcohol policy. And finally, we'll have Michael O'Flaherty from Gibson Sheat Lawyers, and he's going to give us some advice on what your obligations are as a transport operator and also what your rights are in terms of conducting workplace testing. So just in terms of housekeeping, if you have any questions, put those into the chat. We're going to answer some of those questions at the end of each presenter, but also we will be able to answer some of those questions afterwards, so offline. So put your questions into there. However, my contact email and Rob's contact email is on screen, so take a note of that. You can contact us through that or through your respective association, and we will be making the recording available on our respective member portals. So very quickly, why are we here? Well, there's a new act that's been passed that comes into effect from 15 December. It's called the Land Transport Drug Driving Amendment Act. And it provides a new roadside oral fluid testing regime for drug impairment. And essentially, it's giving the police the same powers as with alcohol breath testing. So instead of a machine that you blow into for alcohol, this is going to be a saliva test, but it's otherwise the same principle. So on that basis, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Inspector Scott Richardson from the Police Commercial Vehicle Safety Team, and they're responsible for actually rolling this new regime out. And he's going to cover what that is, what are the 4 drugs that they're testing for, how impairment is measured, and what the penalties and test fees are. So I'll hand over to Scott. And you're on mute, Scott.
Not a great start. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Richardson. I'm the Acting National Manager of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Team. Normally, I'm the Deployment Manager. I'm based out of Nelson. A little bit of background. I've been in the police coming up 34 years, and of those 34, I've spent 10 years of those in road policing. So, yeah, CVST are going to be taking a leadership role in delivering the oral fluid testing. Can everyone see those slides all right? Those slides showing up?
Yes.
Okay. Right. The reason is why we're going in this direction is we've had a dramatic increase over the last 10 or 20 years in relation to drug driving. I'm just reviewing the latest crashes for the last 3 years in the heavy motor vehicle industry, and drug driving actually is 3 times as more likely to be cause of the crash than alcohol. So it's been something that's been rising across the board. And here in Nelson, where I live, we have as many deaths every year attributable to meth than we do to alcohol. So, in our aim to keep the roads safe, this is something we've been looking at, getting a handle on for quite some time. We initially tried a new program a couple of years ago, but the technology at the time wasn't in the place where we could actually advance it, and it got put on hold, and now we've relaunched with this new legislation. We will test, the police will test drivers for specified drugs on the roadside. That starts the 15th of December. We're doing a soft launch that's in Wellington, and with IPT, if someone's trying to ring me, with IPT, and also which is the booze bust, the tag groups, and selected road policing staff, including some of the CVS team from Plympton. Obviously, the aim of this is to deter drug driving, to stop those who are impaired by drugs affecting road safety, and to reduce the number of deaths and serious injuries on the roads. So, what is the roadside oral fluid testing? Exactly what it as it's described. It's oral test very much like they have in Australia. You can see there that we have oral testing. It just basically completes the square of the testing that we can do. We will always do alcohol testing, of course. We do blood testing as part of alcohol testing, but also as part of crash investigations. We've always had compulsory impairment testing, which is a physical test, and this is kind of closing the loop, and so we have a full spectrum of tests that we can do to remove drug drivers from the road. The process is infringement based, which I'll get into later. But as you're going through, as officers are being taking people through the process, if at any point they get to the belief that the person is actually impaired, they can change course and go down a compulsory impairment test regime, which of course is an infringement based, that it gets people going to court. Right, so the drugs that we're going to be testing for, I'll show you the device in a moment, but at the roadside, we'll be testing for cannabis and methamphetamine, ecstasy and cocaine. We anticipate that cannabis and methamphetamine will probably be the biggest ones that we will see, and in the trucking industry, we suspect that methamphetamine, if we had to guess, that'll be the one that that we see the most. Once you've failed the test, a saliva test is taken from you and sent to a lab, and that test lists, that sample is tested for 25 qualifying drugs that are on the Schedule 5 of the Land Transport Act. So there's at the roadside, we'll be only testing for those 4 illicit drugs, and we anticipate 12% fail rate at the roadside for drugs. Talking to my counterparts in Australia, they do targeted, selected drug testing of truck drivers and heavy motor vehicles, and their strike rate is 1 in 6. So that's what we're anticipating. The test itself, I'm not sure. I think the minister did a launch in the last couple of weeks. The initial test is very much like a COVID test, and it takes about 5 minutes. If that is passed, that is it. It's over, and the driver just carries on, much like a passive test or a breath screening test on the side of the road. In the commercial vehicle safety centres, when we're running these tests, we anticipate that the driver would be taken to one side and undertake that while the VSOs and the officers are going through the truck. So it isn't actually going to create much delay any more than just the normal cursory checks of the ruck and the warrants and certificates, etc. If, however, that first test is a failure, then we go on to the next stage, which is a saliva sample, and that can take, depending on the person, can take 2 to 10 minutes to do. That saliva sample is taken and then sent to a lab, and as I said before, it's tested for 25 different drugs. This is the device that we'll be using for the screening test. It's made in Germany, in Munich. It's very robust system they have. They actually keep libraries of every device they make. So if there's ever any doubt about the quality of a one, they can actually pull one out of their library and check that there's a fault. Basically, the blue part here is removed from the device, and a person is asked to lick the inside of their mouth 3 times, and then they just drag it once down the tongue. They put it back into the device, and after 5 minutes, it comes up like a COVID test. You can see a very faint blue line there. When it's correctly used, that line will turn red. That's to check that it's a proper test. And then depending if there's any drugs, secondary lines will show up. So for this example, if there was a second line in the middle, that would show that the person's tested positive for cocaine. If you fail the oral fluid test, you go to the oral fluid collection, and this paddle here is placed underneath your tongue and stays there for 2 to 5, 10 minutes, depending how long it takes for it to register it has enough saliva in it. The reason it's placed under the tongue is that's where the saliva glands are. So after 2 to 5 minutes, that top will go blue, and that says that we've got enough of a saliva sample that the laboratory can test, and then it is sealed into that container, much like the blood tests or any other DNA tests that we take. And then so the process is the driver is stopped and is given a roadside, the tongue swab. If drugs are detected, or no drugs are detected, they're free to go. If the drugs are detected, they go to the next process, saliva sample, and that's sent off for analysis. And then before people leave, they must undergo a second roadside test. So you do the tongue test, you've got drugs in your system, we take saliva, and then before you're allowed to drive away, you have to do a secondary tongue test. That was required. We talked about that a lot, but Parliament has decided that's what they want to do. They don't want to be infringing on people's rights without being 100% sure. So that second test, if it is positive as well, the person is forbidden to drive for 12 hours on the spot. If they refuse to take that second test, they're forbidden to drive for 12 hours on the spot. So that's just a double check they have there to make sure that that we're not forbidding people to drive who've got actually no drugs in their system. That saliva sample that it's taken is sent away to the laboratory, and that'll return a result to the officer. And this is the infringement regime that we're looking at. The two positive drug screening tests, as I said, you're prohibited from driving for 12 hours. When that sample comes back, the officers will get an email or a certificate in the mail. And if it's got one drug present, it's $200.50 demerit points, which is the same as low-level drunk driving. And if you have 2 or more drugs present, it's $400.75, and much like the drunk driving process, if you refuse or you end up in a much worse position with $475 and being forbidden to drive on the spot. So that's where we are there. That's the infringement. But as I said, if they are going through the oral fluid process and they can have a look at this person and go, well, they're quite clearly impaired, they can stop the process and go into an impairment test, which is the standing on one foot, and the eye tests, the balance tests, all the sort of things that you see state troopers doing on highways in America, but you don't actually see very commonly here in New Zealand. And at the end of that compulsory impairment test, drivers typically have a blood test taken. So that's very much like a drug driving test. And when will it begin? It will be beginning on Wellington in December, and the end of January towards February, we'll be launching in the lower North Island. We've already got the Plymouton team have been trained on it. And then it's going to a nationwide rollout from April next year. The reason for the soft launch, as it were, is initially we weren't able to get the checklist that we do people for drunk driving and drug driving. There's actually a checklist that's done on mobility on people's phones, which makes it a lot easier. And the IT weren't able to get that solution in place for us in time. So eventually, come April, we'll be moving everything across to the process will be done on phones, but initially it's going to be done on paper, like drunk drivers were in 1992 when I joined. So, and so the key takeaways, it doesn't replace any of the other systems we have. It complements it. Alcohol is obviously going to be our primary test that we do. Every driver stopped will be breath tested. We're contracted with the NZTA to deliver 50,000 of these in the first year, which is not much compared. We will deliver 4 million breath tests this year. So this is going to be a lot more targeted. That only accounts for 137 a day for the whole country. So it is going to start off light, but I can see as the results get out and we get an idea of how bad it is out there, that the funding for that will increase, and we'll see a lot more of it to the point where it just becomes BAU. And as I said earlier, the other takeaways there is people that fail the test twice on the side of the road, off the road for 12 hours instantly. And that has some implications, obviously, for buses full of people and trucks full of stock and frozen goods. But we've been talking to the industry in the lead up to this, and there's a lot of people have already turned their mind to that. And as an industry, I know you're a resourceful lot, and I'm sure that you'll be working out connections and pulling on relationships to make sure that you can keep everything going, and the impact of your driver being asked to be off the road for 12 hours. Yeah, and that's just another slide on that rollout. 50,000. That 50,000 tests start on July next year. So every year for the next 3 years after that, we'll be doing 50,000. But as I said, once we get a handle on it and find out whether we have problems in certain parts of the industry or certain parts of the country, that's when we'll be doing that. So, any questions?
So,
thank you, Scott.
Scott, there's no questions in the post yet, but I've had 2 from members, and I guess one thing that's true is, in terms of certainties, you've got death taxes and false positives. You've got 2 tests to mitigate the risk of false positives. But some of our members are actually worried about positives from drivers who are on ADHD medicine, medicinal cannabis and the likes. Can you talk about, given the lack of discretion, what thinking's gone into that from a police enforcement perspective? I don't think you've got much choice, but I guess I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, a lot of the other drugs that will be tested for will be picked up only at the lab, and then once it goes down that process, it's an infringement. The person isn't forbidden to drive for 12 hours again, and that's when doctor certificates and information backwards and forwards will be able to be submitted to the Infringement Bureau to cover that. Medicinal cannabis, I'm unsure. I think it will have to be, that'll be something that'll have to be probably explored the same sort of way. The only problem with that is it could fail on the sides of the road. Unlike Australia, we have the tests that we've got here in New Zealand. Australia have any amount of drugs. The saliva samples they use there, any amount of drugs, you're offside, you've got a ticket. New Zealand is actually, I think, a world first in this, is that they've actually built in a level within the screening tests for impairment. So it's not a have drugs, have no drugs, you're in, you're out system. So people, there will be, chances are, if they're taking the medications as prescribed, and that's always an issue that we do have problems with, they may well fall under the that impairment level that these devices are set for. And if they are not taking them to as prescribed, or the prescribed level is wrong, then that's something they need to investigate with their doctor, and then we'll be taking on board. But yeah, it is a lot more nuanced than what Australia has. Australia, anything at all, you could get picked up on a Sunday night for cannabis that you took on a Friday, whereas here they've actually built in a level of impairment to it, because that's what, this isn't. We're not stopping people for the Misuse of Drugs Act. We're stopping people to try and keep the roads safe for you and all your drivers and all the companies out there. So impairment is the major focus.
Thanks, Scott. There's no more questions in the post, but if people do want to post anything, we might have time to come back at the end and bring Scott back in.
That'll be fine.
There is actually a question in the Q&A, so I'll read that out. If the second tongue test comes back negative, is the first tongue test disregarded, or will you still send the saliva to the lab?
The saliva sample will still go to the lab. But what we'll do with those, as I said earlier, that this German crowd, they keep a library. Then we will be, that'll, as part of the review process, we'll be going back to them and going, well, why did this happen? My understanding is that in all the testing that we didn't have false positives. I think the system is actually geared up to, if it fails, it shows negative. We didn't get any false positives in any of the testing for these devices. So yeah, the sample, in short, the sample is still sent away, and that'll be part of the review process for those batches of oral tests. But that will be, we're not expecting that at this stage.
I've got one other, now that I've refreshed my questions, Scott, which I'll have to keep doing. Will the testing rollout be focused on checkpoint areas such as, weighbridges and the likes, where you find the CVST team, or can you expect this to happen across the country? For
Initially,
heavy vehicles, I mean.
Yeah. We like some of the commercial vehicle safety centres like Stanley Street, Rakaia and Glasnevin would lend themselves quite easily to operate these. Some of the locations we cannot. Ahakia, for example, poses some problems because it's adjacent to Air Force land, and we can't leave trucks there overnight. So we would, but if someone's failed a drugs test, we can't tell them to drive 100 metres down the road to the next spot to offload their truck. So it is going to be on a bit of a case-by-case basis. Initially, some of the testing you will see will be the booze bus, or highway patrol, and they will be working with us at those commercial vehicle sites. But as it becomes the BAU, you could see it at weigh pits, in Northland on the side of the road there. It could be anywhere, but for us, one of the major considerations is, if this person is going to fail a test and not going to be able to drive, what are we going to do with the truck? So it's going to be, predominantly in areas there where we can secure the truck, and it's not going to create a road hazard by sitting on the side of State Highway 1.
There's one other question, which I think is a quick one. Pretty sure I know the answer to it, but if a driver is tested positive for amphetamines and has a prescription, can they drive away?
No.
So if you fail the two tests, you cannot drive away.
No.
even if you've got a doctor's note, etc., etc. It's something that's really important people understand.
Yeah, it is, and we couldn't build that into it because it would, it had to be an absolute, and that's why it's only a 12-hour forbidden, because it's about that low level impairment. Whereas with a lot of, with alcohol, for example, you're often 28 days is your stand down period for driving, depending on the level of intoxication. So,
which goes to your point before, that if a driver has simply taken too much prescription medicine and they get 2 false tests, owners, operators, managers need to be thinking about contingency plans for those scenarios, because there is no discretion to the officer on roadside to say, okay, I see you've got a prescription letter from your doctor.
No, and that's something that's going to have to go into the planning, and people are going to, and I'm sure people have been doing this for months. They're going to have to revisit their HR processes, and it's good that you have a lawyer on at the end of this to, to say what that looks like. But it's important that you do get that right, and it's a good opportunity because we've had. I'm in the South Island. We've had in the last 6 months, we've had a fatal involving drugs in Blenheim with a truck, and we've had where the truck driver was killed, and we've had a truck crash in Canterbury where a person was on meth and killed a member of the public. So it is out there, and it's something we won't know the full extent for probably a year. But you've got to know that if the trucking industry or the bus industry or any particular part quickly pops up, people are going to be asking, the focus will pivot. And so, the attention will change as the data comes out.
Thanks, Scott. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Right. Just for those who have joined a little bit later, just so you know, we are recording this presentation and we'll be making that available through our respective member portals. And it's good to see we've got people putting questions in the chat. We won't be able to answer them all, but we will answer them offline. So just keep an eye on that. So our next speaker is Glenn Dobson from the Drug Detection Agency. He's going to give a little bit of background on who they are and what they see when they're doing workplace testing, and also what operators can do to actually help address impaired drivers. So go ahead, Glenn.
Great, thanks, Mark. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, but it's showing the first and the second slide.
Okay. How's that now? Sorry.
No, it's still the same. It needs to be the presentation view. That's it. Perfect.
That's okay. Great, thank you. Technology is best. Hey, thanks very much for your time. Scott, that was really good. That was interesting, and I know that's been a big topic of conversation with a lot of our clients in relation to how the roadside drug testing is rolling out. From TDA's perspective, just a quick 2 secs about us. We've been in business for 20 years. We're a private organisation. We're not a government organisation at all. We do predominantly workplace drug testing, and we do a variety, and I'll talk a little bit further in relation to it. We do a variety of oral fluid testing and urine testing in both New Zealand and Australia. I guess if I kick off with the first slide there, it's in relation to what the ideal process is around workplace drug testing for workplaces like our transport industry and so on. It's about getting people home at the end of the day. It's around safety. It's around making sure that the employers manage the risk of impairment of drugs in the workplace. Employers have a responsibility under the Health and Safety at Work Act to manage risks, and drugs and alcohol are a recognised risk in workplaces, and so there's an obligation to try and manage those risks. From our perspective, and certainly our legal friend will come in at the end and no doubt we'll talk about this, but it absolutely needs to start at a strong, robust policy. That's a drug and alcohol policy for all workplaces, and that policy gives you the legal framework that can request drug testing within the workplace. That drug and alcohol policy needs to be structured correctly. If the drug and alcohol policy says that at the end of every drug test, everyone gets a pink ice cream. You'd better make sure that everyone gets a pink ice cream at the end of every drug and alcohol test, because you need to do what the policy says you will do. And again, I'm sure our lawyer on this will reinforce this, but often when employers get in challenges around their drug and alcohol policy, it's not so much what the policy says, but it's that the fact they haven't followed the policy strictly, and that's where they can get themselves in some trouble. From our perspective, it's really strongly recommended that the policy is reviewed at least on an annual basis. You need to make sure that it's up to date. You need to make sure that it's a good, strong, robust working policy that's practical, and it guides the actions and the culture of the company in relation to drug and alcohol testing itself. The next stage in relation to the rollout of any ideal process, from our perspective, is training and education. And that can be as simple as toolboxes before a shift, toolboxes as part of a team meeting, a 5 or 10 minute session once every quarter in relation to what's happening in the workplace, what's happening around the drug and alcohol policy, what the company's stance is around the alcohol limit from the drug and alcohol policy. We often attend and support clients in toolboxes as well to talk about drug trends and what we're seeing, but it's around making it an interactive approach to it all, so that the employees understand the policy, understand their rights, understand how the drug and alcohol testing works, and can ask questions. And that training and education can go right down to also formal training. We ourselves run a 4-hour half-day session for managers on how they can apply their policies, how they can, we go through scenarios of how employees may present and the challenges around some of those scenarios, and how best to apply the policy in those different scenarios and so on. The other challenge too, obviously, is as we have staff churn and so on, we need to make sure that employees, managers, everyone at the company is aware of the drug and alcohol policy, how the drug and alcohol testing regime works, and so that training education is part of that as well. And then lastly, it goes down to the actual testing itself, the core of what it's all about around the safety. You need to understand the reasons why you test. There's multiple reasons. The stock standard reasons for testing is a lot of companies do pre-employment drug testing first. It's part of the due diligence to make sure they're not bringing in what may be deemed an issue through drug use into the company before they hire a person. Random drug testing is very common in safety sensitive roles. Safety sensitive is not legally defined, so it's up to the company to define what is a safety sensitive role. Obviously, in the transport industry, it's pretty obvious around driving big trucks, buses, coaches, and so forth. But it can go down to whether people may have an administrative role within the company, but have access to safety-sensitive areas. So it's up to the employer to identify where they think the safety-sensitive roles start and stop for the random testing. There's also post-incident testing. There's also reasonable cause testing, and that's one of the bigger challenging ones for workplaces, and that's where some training comes in. That's where a manager may say, or another employee may say, I think Tom or I think Julie here is under the influence or affected by a drug, and here's my reasons around it. And that's when they'll make a reasonable cause call to actually do a drug test in that scenario. Very tricky, very challenging, but is a realistic option of why drug testing does take place in the workplace. I'll jump into the types of testing we do traditionally in workplaces. There's really, I've got 3 pictures there. The first picture on the left, for those that haven't seen it before, is a urine screening device. The one in the middle is an oral fluid screening device. It's different to one that Scott just showed you from the police roadside testing. It uses the same technology, but it just tests for a lot more drugs, and it's just a different manufacturer. The picture on the right there is hair testing. I'll talk about that very briefly. And the one that hasn't got a picture there is a lab-based testing, which Scott talked about before, but I'll go through all those different scenarios. First and foremost, from our experience, there is no one perfect drug testing method. They all have their pros, they all have their cons, and a lot of it comes down to the scenario and what you're trying to achieve in each of those different scenarios. In relation to those first 2 there, urine and oral fluid, those are screens, and what that means is that they give you an indication of a drug being present at the time we take the sample. But in drug testing, there's a trade-off between accuracy and time and cost. And so screens are very good, as Scott's talked about from the Roadside oral fluid drug testing perspective, but screens are not 100% accurate. And we took some attendees before asked questions around false positive and false negatives. Screens, whether it's oral fluid or whether it's urine, the devices are still in the high 90% accuracy rate, so very highly accurate, but still not 100% accurate. The best gold standard testing is lab-based testing, and so that's why in a workplace drug test perspective, if either a urine or an oral fluid screen indicates drugs, a sample is sent to the lab, and the lab confirms what drugs are present and at what level. And that's exactly the same scenario as the new Roadside oral fluid testing that Scott talked about before is doing. From the urine drug testing perspective, in New Zealand with TDA, about 85% of the testing we do is urine based and about 15% is oral fluid based. Urine testing, the same as oral fluid testing, the processes will take the donor into either a specifically set up area, either in the workplace itself or in our own offices, or we also have accredited vans that turn up at the work site so that create as least disruption as possible. With the donor present for urine testing, we capture the donor's details. We have to prove identity first. There's workplace drug testing standards both for urine testing and oral fluid testing, and TDDA are accredited to those standards. So there are certain steps we have to do every single time because the standard says we must do it this way. First and foremost, we have to capture the donor's identity. We have to prove that the donor is who they say they are. That's generally by photo ID. That's a driver's license, a passport, and so forth. Or it can be, if the person doesn't have photo ID, it can be a manager saying, yes, I've worked with Tom here for the last 10 years and I can confirm that is Tom. A urine perspective, we have to get the person to wash their hands first before they provide a urine sample. That's so that they don't try and cheat a urine sample by, when they produce the urine sample, peeing onto their fingers, and underneath their fingernails they have contaminants like bleach or anything else that may taint the urine sample. Then we'll take them into the toilet area and we will collect the urine sample into the little round cup that you can see there. The collection process for the urine sample is what's called a monitored collection. So what we do is we have our technician stand behind the shoulder of a male donor producing the urine, or just slightly around the corner of a female donor, but so we can see the female's knees. But the main thing is you don't see the genitalia. It's not fully observed, but it's monitored. From a male's perspective, very, very similar to in a public urinal toilets where you're waiting in queue to use a toilet. Same sort of privacy options around there. The standard allows for monitored collection, so it reduces the chances of cheating the sample collection. From a urine perspective, there are ways that people can try and cheat a urine sample collection. You can go to any open shop that supplies synthetic urine and buy synthetic urine over the counter. It's not illegal to possess or own or use synthetic urine. People will also try and use other people's clean urine, and they'll try and use that at times for samples. The challenge is trying to produce that urine sample of somebody else's or synthetic urine when a testing technician is standing over their shoulder and is seeing the gross body movements and so on. Once we've collected the urine sample, it goes through a number of integrity tests. We look at the sample to make sure it visually looks okay. It goes through a temperature test to make sure that it's within a certain specified temperature, which is between 33 to 38 degrees Celsius, to make sure it's been freshly produced out of the body. And then it goes through, within the cup, has tests within the cup that test certain chemical makeups of the urine sample, including pH level, creatinine, nitrates, and all that sort of thing. And that just shows that it's human urine if it passes those tests. Once it goes through all that, then we actually look for the drugs itself. And we test for up to 9 drugs in the screen. And we've recently just started testing for fentanyl and tramadol, because there's some opioids that we're starting to see globally coming out. From an oral fluid perspective, very similar to what Scott's explained, we'll collect the donor's ID, as I said before. We'll have them take an oral fluid sample using a swab, similar to what Scott's talked about, slightly differently. And then again, we'll test that oral fluid sample in the device, again, for those 9 drugs. An oral fluid sample collection can be cheated as well. So as part of the standard, people have to confirm they haven't consumed anything orally for the last 10 minutes, because a hot drink, a hot cup of tea, a hot cup of coffee can clean the oral cavity and flush the area from drugs. And also chewing gum can do the same as well. So there are ways around doing that, and that's part of the, again, the standard, so that we do it correctly as part of our accreditation. Again, for the urine or the oral fluid, if either sample indicates that drugs are present, we then take another sample and send it to the lab, where the lab confirms, number one, that the drug is present, and secondly, at what quantity the drug is present. Our testing devices, like Scott said before, have cutoff levels, so drugs will only indicate if they're above that cutoff level. Our cutoff level, as I understand it, for workplace drug testing is slightly higher than the roadside drug testing cutoffs. And that's, again, set in the standard. And some of that is around also getting rid of environmental contamination. One of the arguments that pops up every so often is a donor was at a party on Saturday night where everyone was smoking cannabis. They didn't actively consume cannabis themselves, but they may have passively consumed it because they were in the room with other people that were smoking it. The cutoff level is set at a level where that type of passive inhalation will not show up in the drug test itself. Hair testing, slightly different. It's not used often in workplaces. Hair testing really is only used for pre-employment testing for workplaces. It won't show one-off use. What it shows is lifestyle use, or if a person is using drugs over a period consistently. Hair testing won't show if you used it once 5 or 6 days ago. The advantage of hair testing is that it can look a long way back into the person's history. So depending on the length of a person's hair, we can look back as far as 12 months in relation to a person's drug taking history. So for a pre-employment perspective, that's quite useful. For the type of drug testing around random, reasonable cause, post-incident in a workplace, not useful, and that type of information isn't relevant. What are we seeing at the moment? So from TDA's perspective, we carry about 250,000 drug tests per annum. In New Zealand, the screen result, because it's a screen, because it's not confirmed, we can't call it a positive result. So the standard says it's not confirmed in the lab, so a screen result, it has to be called a non-negative if it indicates drugs are present. So in New Zealand, for our drug testing in New Zealand for screening, we see about a 3.75% non-negative, for want of a better term, positive result. So out of 100 drug tests we do, 3.75% of them show drugs in the person's system. In Australia, that's slightly lower at 3.4%. The rationale or the reasoning around that is, in Australia, oral fluid testing is slightly more popular than it is in New Zealand, and the oral fluid testing methodology and science doesn't look as far back in the history of the person taking drugs as urine does. For oral fluid testing, generally it's more about the immediate use, so it's almost immediate to about 6 to 12 hours back in the history. From oral fluid, it's 4 hours after ingesting the drug to about 48 hours. So it looks back a lot further. I've got on there in the bottom there the Quest Drug Testing Index. That's a US-based index, and that's 8 million samples. So it's a lot more than obviously what TDA does, but that shows that America has a 4.4% positive rate. America, as we know, has a very big drug problem globally. It's known, and so that's the positivity rate in the workplace in America. What we're seeing nationally in New Zealand for all workplaces, as opposed to the transport industry, and I've listed just a couple of drugs there. THC, which is the active compound within cannabis, is our biggest drug that we see. So of the drugs that show positive, 70% of the time, almost 70% of the time, nationally, we see cannabis. From the transport industry, that's much lower. It's only 57.8% of the time, so much lower, so less cannabis in the workplace and transport industry compared to the general population. The next one down is ATS, that's amphetamine type substances, or methamphetamine. Amphetamine type substances is just a drug testing industry term. It includes methamphetamine and amphetamines. So 28 just over 28% of the time in New Zealand, we see methamphetamine. Again, the positive thing from transport industry is that's slightly lower. That's at 26.1%. The concerning one for the transport industry is the opioid positive rate is much higher for the transport industry at 26%, as opposed to the national level at 16%. That may be the nature of the beast in relation to the type of work that's being done. There may be a lot more painkillers being used and legitimate opioid use or overuse of prescriptions. The other slightly higher rate we see in the transport industry is benzodiazepines, your sedatives and sleeping type pills. Transport industry is 5.7% as opposed to the national average is 3.9%. So some good stuff there in relation to some drugs being lower in transport and some challenging stuff with some other class of drugs being higher. What we also see, and this is an interesting one, this is not TDDA statistics, this is the wastewater testing that the government do in New Zealand. So this captures about 70% of the population of New Zealand, so a good data set from that. And the wastewater testing tests for 3 types of drugs. The top blue line there is methamphetamine, the green line is MDMA or ecstasy, and the bottom yellow line is cocaine. The interesting one there, and I'm not sure if everyone here heard this in the media, but about the middle of last year, we had almost a doubling of methamphetamine. We went through a massive spike in methamphetamine use across the country. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of ones in relation to how we may evolve, what we might see in the future. First and foremost, we've touched on a little bit medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis is a big thing in New Zealand at the moment. This is my 2016 medicinal cannabis card that I got over in the States when I was over there attending a conference, because we wanted to test how easy it was to get medicinal cannabis in the United States before it came to New Zealand. I got this medicinal cannabis card within 5 minutes of attending a doctor. I said I was traveling around the States for a year. I told the doctor that I had some pain and I had trouble sleeping, but also I quite like getting high. I got this medicinal cannabis card within 5 minutes. It wasn't a consultation in person with the doctor. It was via a video call, and allowed me to buy an ounce of cannabis, dried cannabis, and smoke it 1 ounce every day for a year. The challenges in the New Zealand framework for medicinal cannabis, whilst it is tighter, whilst it is better, there are still challenges in the fact that a medicinal cannabis person can smoke dry cannabis like a joint, and it can be called medicinal cannabis. It has a high content of THC in it still, and that's the part that is the psychoactive part of the drug that you'll also buy on the black market. It was only, I think, yesterday or the day before, Christchurch police arrested 3 people that had a license and were legitimately growing cannabis as part of the medicinal cannabis scheme. They were cultivating cannabis legally, but they were selling it on the black market as well. So they were selling it illegally. And that's the challenges around the medicinal cannabis scheme in New Zealand at the moment. The challenges from an employer's perspective is drug testing will not differentiate between whether the cannabis was consumed correctly or legitimately through a medicinal cannabis prescription, or illicitly through the black market and a joint bought illegally. There are things called medical review officers that are specifically trained doctors that will look at a donor's drug test result. They will look at the prescription, and they will be able to give an indication of whether that person is consuming the drug, whether it's medicinal cannabis, whether it's a prescription, any other prescription drug in line with a prescription, or whether the drug's been overused. Again, the challenge for an employer is that takes extra time, that takes extra cost, which is challenging. And lastly, the other drugs that we're really seeing, and this is an issue that has obviously popped up in the stats that I showed before in the transport industry, is opioids. Opioids are becoming a real problem across Australasia. We're starting to see a real increase in opioid use in New Zealand. We know tramadol use is on the increase. We know that doctors are prescribing tramadol more. It is a legitimate medication. There's no doubt about it. It's a legitimate painkiller. The issue is it also affects the user, and it says do not use heavy machinery when you're using tramadol, because it affects the person's ability to respond around decision making and also actions and impairment and so on. A couple of years ago, there was a horrific bus crash in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales in Australia, where the driver that was addicted to tramadol crashed and killed 10 people. This is what we're starting to see become more prevalent in New Zealand in our drug testing. The tramadols, the opioids, the oxycodone. The area that this concerns us too, I guess, is this is what the drug manufacturers, the cartels globally, are starting to make more because they make more money out of it. It's easier for them to produce in the labs across the world. It's much more potent than other drugs, so they don't have to have as much, so it's easier to move and get through borders and so forth as well. So that's really where we're starting to get concerned from a workplace perspective and the risks around that. And that's it from my perspective. I'll just stop sharing the screen. And if there's any questions, happy to take them.
Glenn, I think there's one quick comment here from Lana Thomas. You might want to talk to something about Dave shaving his head, but I think that feels a bit personal. And there weren't any extra questions for you. There's a couple I'd like to ask you and Scott if we have time at the end, but I think we'll move on to Michael now.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, so I'll introduce our final speaker, which is Michael O'Flaherty from Gibson Sheat Lawyers, and they have quite a lot of familiarity with transport legislation. So I've asked them to speak about, or what are your obligations as owners, managers or supervisors under the Health and Safety and Workplace Act. And also, what are your rights as employers to undertake workplace substance testing and under what grounds? And also advice on what you need to have in your employment contracts to enable you to do those random workplace tests, and also what you need to have to cover off so that the employer informs you if they've had any infringements, even as a private driver, which might put their heavy vehicle license or endorsement at risk. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Don't be alarmed, people. That is me in the photo. I haven't had a lot of hair testing with the TDDA. I've just had 2 children since that photo was taken. So I'm a senior associate here at Gibson Sheat Lawyers, and I've been asked to just do a bit of presentation on the legal aspects and the employment aspects, although I think a lot of the questions will be TBA at this point in terms of what's likely to be everyone's rights and obligations in respect of this particular issue, because it hasn't happened yet. So there's a bit of a cover of the agenda, what I'm going to run through today, but Mark, you've done a good job just covering that. And the final point around when things go wrong scenario, we'll get to that at the end, and I suspect that's probably where a lot of questions will come in as well. So just a quick brief overview of everyone's rights and responsibilities under the Health and Safety at Work Act, because I imagine most of the people that are attending today are doing so on the basis that they are PCBUs, and it's likely that we've got a lot of people in the room that are officers as well, which are either directors if it's a company, or if it's a CEO, someone who exerts a lot of control over the or influence over the workers at the workplace. And then the final category there of people who have responsibilities are workers themselves. So making sure that workers educate themselves and stay up to date with all health and safety instructions. So in respect of this particular issue, it would be, if you are looking at adopting a pamphlet or a policy on how roadside testing, the roadside drug testing is going to work, and other policies you might want to adopt around drug testing generally, making sure that the workers have access to that information so that they can also fulfil their obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Some of the relevant duties I've covered there, generally it's just got to eliminate your risk to health and safety and minimise it where you can't, eliminating it. And the couple of the duties that ways you can go about doing that is providing information to people, training them, providing instructions. So this is all things like, if you are adopting policies, making sure people have it, or you might want to get Scott or Glenn to come in and do a presentation for your work base, or provide some materials or on this particular issue as well. I think everyone attending this themselves is also helping on that final category of acquiring and keeping up to date with knowledge, and that's a good start. You can show that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing by trying to stay educated with any changes to the law. The key for, I think most people here want to know, well, what are my rights in terms of being able to undertake drug testing of people in the workplace? Because while we're talking about what's going to happen with the roadside drug testing, I think one of the effective ways of eliminating that risk is probably going to be to adopt your own testing regime, which may include, like was covered by Glenn, things like random testing or pre-work testing, or where there's been incidences that would require it. And I'm going to cover that shortly in another slide in a bit of detail around what those clauses might be. But generally, you're not going to be able to test every worker before they go out for each time they drive or before they drive, and it's not practical to think that would be the way to eliminate that risk generally. But I think if you put in place a policy that shows when you will be testing, and you might have some instances where you do follow that, then that's going to be great. And if you've got it covered in a policy, that's good. It shows that you're trying to minimize that risk because you're trying to bring people's attention to it. And if you've got it covered in your employment agreements, that's also great because you're keeping it front of mind before the employment relationship is brought to everyone's attention. This is something we're looking at doing, or this is something that we do because we take it seriously, because it's a matter of health and safety. There's no statutory entitlement to test your workers. That's been developed through the common law, through case law, and the balancing act in terms of looking at whether it's an intrusion into someone's privacy or whether it's required for health and safety. The greater that the greater the health and safety risk, the lower the intrusion it is into someone's privacy. So if you've got someone in my role where there's very little health and safety risk for what I do on a day-to-day basis, drug testing would probably be a little bit lower, or it'd be more of a breach of my privacy to do that than it would be for someone who's operating heavy machinery. So that's sort of how the scale works. And I think if you've got it covered in your policy and you've got it covered in your employment agreement, then that's also going to help in terms of justifying undertaking that testing. But generally, it's pretty accepted that is something that would be relevant for your line of work or your industry anyway. And I'm sure a lot of people have got these policies in place in their employment agreements anyway. But if not, maybe consider just reviewing your documentation that you've got in place. So around just, I'm not going to put the 13 clause covering the drug policy or drug testing that I would put in a normal employment agreement. But these are sort of the general categories, and I think Glenn touched on them in terms of when you're going to look at doing your drug testing. So unannounced random testing, and that's likely to be in situations where you've got safety sensitive positions. So I'm sure that a lot of the workers that we're talking about here would be in that space. And then for all, you might have it after they've had an accident or near miss, or you might have it where there's reasonable cause. And I've had employers call me about that from time to time. And normally there's a lot of pushback from employees who don't want to go and undertake that testing, or you might find that they're taking sick leave at that time. And that's where we get involved in terms of providing advice to make sure that employers are still complying with their obligations as a fair and reasonable employer, but aren't setting themselves up to fail to do something later on. And I think Glenn made a really good point about picking out your policy and making sure you adhere to it, because a lot of times people start doing things and then they don't actually look at the documentation that sets out the process for them to follow. So it's really important that you keep that front of mind. Keep my name front of mind first, but then keep the policy front of mind second. So make sure that you know that you're following the right rules, or you're doing what you say you're going to do. Again, what to put in there. So I think it might be useful to put in this particular situation when we're talking about people who have failed a roadside test, a positive obligation for them to report these. And it probably falls under their duty as a worker under the Health and Safety at Work Act to actually report that, because it is a health and safety matter if they've failed a roadside drug test. And we're going to come to it in my scenario. I imagine if it's someone who's driving a bus to a Christmas party, for example, I think there's going to be other factors in terms of people being brought to people's attention pretty smartly anyway, that their driver can't drive for 12 hours. But making sure that you try and educate people around it's actually more in their interest to report these things through to their employer rather than to not do so in these instances. And it might be that you try and do it for people, not even when they're not at work, but to report when these sort of issues arise because it might affect their employment. You might find you have a lot of pushback from people saying it's a breach of my privacy, and that's where you're going to need to do that assessment of, was it fair and reasonable for an employer to expect that information to be provided, or is it a breach of their privacy to ask for information? But ultimately, if it's going to affect their ability to drive, I think it's something that's really relevant for the workplace, and it would be incumbent on the employee acting in good faith to report a failed drug test or a failed roadside drug test to their employer, especially if, say, they were on their way to the workplace at the time that happened. And then a similar disclosure of lab test results and making sure that they're provided with that information, because even if I'll come to this in a minute as well around what your obligations are or your rights are when someone has failed a drug test. You can't just presume because they failed a roadside drug test that they've committed some form of serious misconduct. You're still going to need to undertake your own tests and act as a fair and reasonable employer in that regard. So just a few other things I would consider putting in an employment agreement. A suspension provision, if you think that that's going to be relevant, because it might be that it is an issue of serious misconduct and you want to investigate it. You want to make sure you've got the ability to suspend an employee, and I'm not sure if that's going to be covered in everyone's employment agreements at the moment. EAP clause, I think it is quite important, and we always try and give advice to clients where they are going through a process with an employee who's been accused of serious misconduct or performance issues, even to offer EAP services to that person, so counselling, because obviously there might be an underlying cause for some of this, and I think it's important that employers turn their mind to that in terms of complying with their obligations as a fair and reasonable employer. And then the third one there's around disclosure of medications. So it might be something that you ask for before people start work. What medications are they on? Is there anything that might affect their ability to perform their job? And I think, if you've got people whose lifestyle changes or they have an accident or something happens through the course of their employment, you'll want to turn your mind to making sure that they keep you up to date with that. And again, it's that balancing act of, am I intruding into someone's privacy, or am I doing this on a health and safety basis? But if you have someone who's disclosed to you that they've had a serious injury and that they need to take tramadol, for example, that information isn't brought to you as a surprise when they fail a drug test. It's actually upfront reporting about it, and you can see how you can manage that to be a fair and reasonable employer and make sure you're both acting in your duty of good faith. So the scenario I've presented here is around what happens if something goes wrong, and so the scenario is a worker's driving some perishable cargo through the Mackenzie district. They've just stopped in Fairley and got themselves a pie, and they've moved on further south and run into a roadside drug test. It's good to hear from Scott. Like the locations for these, I probably could have updated my slideshow and done this in one of those locations rather than Mackenzie district, if it's unlikely to be there. But anyway, if they've failed their 2 drug tests and they're stood down from driving, what do you do in that situation? And I was posed this question as a lawyer, and I'm not really sure that there's a legal answer as much. It's more a question of, well, are you thinking as employers, how are you going to combat that situation from a commercial perspective? Because having someone in a remote location like that, how are you going to be able to deal with that issue? And it might be something that people already have in place in terms of protocols, whereas a driver's pulled over and can't drive because I failed a breath alcohol test. And in this situation, I guess it is making sure that you think about whether you can get someone a replacement driver, or you build up relationships with other people in the industry to see if you can work together to combat that issue and provide a solution. And I think that was something that Scott mentioned as well, is actually working with others in the industry and making sure that you can rely on those connections, because the option of having someone sit on the roadside for 12 hours is probably not going to be feasible. And especially if they've got, people waiting to go to their Christmas party, or if they've got some perishable cargo. So it's just really important that we cover off in policies and employment agreement that we've got that positive obligation to report, so we know that these situations happen, and then think about, well, how am I going to combat this practically? I can deal with the legal things and the legal side of things in the mid to long term, but the immediate solution needs to be, well, how do I actually deal with this from a commercial perspective? And it might be that you need to call up someone who's not at work that day, or you've got friends in the industry that can help you in that situation. So when we do look at the midterm and long term, the midterm, obviously, you might want to go through some employment processes. If you are doing those, you need to make sure that you're always looking at whether or not you've got justification for what you're doing for your action. If you are looking at suspending, have you put them on reasonable notice? Have you given them an opportunity to provide their feedback prior to you making that decision? And then you need to make sure you're going through a fair process, which is all about consultation. Like I said before, I wouldn't rely 100% on the failed tests. You might want to look at doing your own tests, or at least asking the person for their reasons for it, because it might be that it's a situation where it is related to some form of medical condition, although I think I heard from Scott that those tests might not cover that anyway, so it might not be that that's an issue for you. I think another thing to do immediate to midterm is pull out your policy, pull out your employment agreement, make sure you've got the situation covered and you're going with that off the bat. There might be some limited license requirements if people have gone too far into their or had too many demerit points. At that point, you need to call up a lawyer, and then the lawyers will talk to the police as well, which are situations we've dealt with previously. And then you might want to think about, well, if we haven't done any testing for a long time, do we want to look at doing that? And we're doing that from a basis of we're trying to remain a worker who complies with, a PCBU that complies with our obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Again, I've got there, consider offering EAP to the person in that position, because at the end of the day, they're still a person. You want to make sure that they're looked after. And I think it's always good for an employer to consider that obligation. Long term, just keep up to date, review your policies, review your employment agreements. If incidents happen, maybe record them, and make sure you can learn from them, because if an accident happens and WorkSafe come knocking, you want to show that you're actually taking note of incidents where you've had employees in these situations, and you can pull out your policies and you can show you've been active, you're reviewing it ahead. The last review wasn't 2022, it was within the year, and you're keeping this issue front of mind, and then educating staff and sending out regular reminders to staff, whether that be by way of testing, or whether it be by way of policy or getting someone in to do a talk. I think it's really important that you show that you're doing all you can, because these situations are likely to be out of your control when they do happen, and all you can do is try and mitigate against it by making sure you've got the right documentation in place and making sure that you're educating staff where you can. And I think attending today's session is a good first step in that respect. So I don't have any more slides. I'm happy to take some questions, and I'll give some free advice out. So lay it on me.
So on that, Michael, shout out for 0800 Road Law. If you want some one-on-one advice, you can also ring Gibson Sheat on that number. There's no questions in the chat specifically for you, Michael. I'm aware we're a few minutes over already, and I'm just watching the numbers drop off a bit. But a few quick fire yes/no questions. So I think coming back to you, Scott and Glenn, saliva testing. Will DNA records be held on file? I presume not for you, Glenn. Scott, can you shed any light on that question?
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't take DNA for that. To have DNA taken off you, taken off you and retained, you have to be convicted of a criminal offence, and this is an infringement offence. So no.
Yep. Thanks. And the other one is in terms of the operator, so a driver working for an operator, what kind of disclosure of the drug does the operator get? Is there any, it's this drug, or is there actually any awareness at all that that's happened at the roadside, or is it up to the operator, the driver, to let the operator know?
Some companies have that. I presume NZTA is still running it, where you can have your drivers on a database of the NZTA, and then when there's a change in their driver status, they would be notified that this driver is been suspended, though I don't think the 12-hour one would pop up on that. So no, I think it's going to be something that they're going to have to be between the employee and the employer.
Which goes back to Michael's point of that's the sort of thing you want to think about putting in your employment agreements and your contracts if you want to put an obligation on the driver to disclose, Michael?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Well, if that's not going to be something that's easily accessible to them, then yes, you want to make sure that you're doing what you can to make it an obligation under good faith for the employee to do that.
And Glenn, with your testing, does the operator get to know what's the client get to know what's been detected, or do they just get there's been a positive result?
Yeah, so we do our testing on our own electronic reporting platform. So as soon as the test is finished at the screen, that goes to whichever authorised person is in the company, and the same with the lab result as well. That if the lab result comes back, the full lab result is in there with the level and what drug was detected.
Thanks. There's one or two other questions, but I think we'll deal with them outside of the webinar. So, Mark, I'll hand it back to you to close off, but thank you to all our presenters.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining. And yes, I was going to thank our three presenters especially. So as I said, we will make this recording available through our member portals, as well as the slide pack from the three presenters. We'll put that together. And but if you have any questions, contact either myself or Rob directly, or you can put questions in the chat and we will endeavour to answer them perhaps in early next week. So thank everybody again for joining us. Hopefully you found it informative. I think there will be certainly some more information from this coming out from both of our associations. And with that, I'll bring it to an end.
Good to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, I'm over your way this afternoon. Maybe we should have a brief catch up.
Good idea.
Just make sure we've got a plan for closing it out.
Closing it out. I agree. Cheers.
See you. Bye.